So good morning, everybody. This is Carrie, and we have Nate Lesnowski with us today, who's going to give a talk on building workstation and application deployment automation with Service Manager and Orchestrator. So I will let Nate take it away, and if there's questions that can't be held until the end, go ahead and type it into the IM, and then I'll try and either Nate, I don't know if you're able to see the questions, or I'll try and alert you that there's something urgent that needs to be answered. Otherwise, we'll have questions and answers at the very end. So go ahead, Nate.
Awesome. Nice to talk to everybody today. My name is Nathan Lesnowski. I am an infrastructure architect with Concurrency, and I've been working with Service Manager for the last several years at companies ranging from very moderate, around 250 users, to companies with several 100,000 users. So had a lot of different experiences working with Service Manager and Orchestrator. And today I'm going to be sharing some examples that I've been using in production at a lot of different companies, and I've been seeing bring very clear ROI to their businesses. And the specific topics I'm going to be covering are going to be workstation and application deployment automation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what's the problem we're trying to solve with this, what the impact has been to some of my customers, and then also how we went about doing it. I'm actually going to walk through building these specific scenarios so you can try these out in your lab. Now, these scenarios are not intended just to be a box product that you would just take and this would be limited only to this scenario. What I really want to try to convey in this session is not only how you can build these specific scenarios, but also how you can take some specific techniques and apply that to the scenario you're trying to solve. So I think this will be a very interesting hour we have together, and I hope that you learn some new techniques from it. All right. So the goal of this is to provide that practical tool. It's a starting point.
Sorry to interrupt you, but your deck is not being shared right now if you're actually showing a deck.
Oh.
I'm not seeing it.
Let's reshare that. That's interesting.
There we go.
Awesome, great.
Thanks.
All right, the goal of this is to provide that technical deep dive. It's to provide with a practical, usable example, and also it will provide you with a starting point to be able to implement these same automations in your company. All right, so what's the problem we're trying to solve? Well, in a lot of the businesses I've been working with, they are coming from varying ranges of how they execute on application deployment, workstation deployment, and server application deployment. A lot of companies aren't using a ton of automation at all. They're simply doing things manually. A lot of other companies, they've got SCCM deployed, but there's a small collection of people who really understand how to leverage SCCM, understand how to leverage Virtual Machine Manager in a way which allows for their application deployments to be truly efficient. Sometimes I find companies spending a lot of time trying to normalize their operations of application deployment or workstation deployment by using procedures that are written down instead of trying to guide users through a basic process. So what I'm going to be walking through is a way to be able to deploy these workstation application automations both to end users and IT. The general idea is that an IT person should be able to deploy an application to an end user with very little training, and it should happen the right way every time. So if I'm an IT user who just got hired at a company tomorrow, I should be able to be trained on that particular process in maybe 15 minutes and have that application deployment happen exactly how my SCCM administrator wants it to happen. What's going to happen with this technology is we're largely going to be using Service Manager as our user experience to be able to do our application deployments. But behind the scenes, we're going to be leveraging the other technologies of Orchestrator, SCCM, and Virtual Machine Manager. The three scenarios, as I started with, are application deployment itself. This could be applications deployed to workstations in the field, or it could be applications that are deployed to servers. It can also be workstation deployment coming from either an existing workstation or a workstation that I just purchased and it's been shipped to one of my facilities. Now, what I've seen with these particular scenarios, and starting with application deployment, is a pretty significant ROI we've been able to implement. Why is that? Well, The reason why is because a lot of times when people are doing application deployment, either the end users don't know how to get applications themselves, they install them incorrectly and they need to be fixed, or there's one or two people who actually know how to do the application deployment themselves, and they get a lot of requests from their end users. Now you might say that person knows how to install those applications in under 5 minutes. But the problem is that because all those other individuals don't know how to do it, every time they need to execute on that actual application deployment, not only is it taking longer because they're needing to contact that individual to add it to the correct environment in SCCM, but that person who has to add it to SCCM may be busy and they have to switch gears from another task to be able to execute on this. So the job that I'm trying to deliver here is I'm trying to show that I have a standardized way that I deploy applications, but anybody in my IT field can go and do that execution, and it's going to happen the right way every time, which makes my SCCM administrator very happy. It's also going to be used for end users to be able to request their own applications. Now, there's a lot of ways for end users to get apps. This is not the only way that we're going to allow end users to be able to get their apps. For example, if you're using SCCM, SCCM has its own agent that allows you to just install applications that have been published to you automatically through its own console, its own client that's running on your workstation. Or it might be publishing them to a phone or something. Those kinds of scenarios don't go away. And in fact, they tailor in well to the scenario I'm going to be showing. Now, what I've found through my average deployments is that I've been able to save around 15 to 30 minutes per application deployment in the customers I've been working with this in. Now, that may seem a little surprising, but that's real ROI metrics we've been able to capture from our customers. That's over 200,000 plus usages of this particular application deployment style. So I think you'll find that this is going to have an opportunity to be able to save you a lot of time. Now, how do we build it? I'm going to demo that. What we'll basically use is a request offering in Service Manager combined with an extended software item class or potentially a new class. There's a reason we use the software item class, and I'll walk through what that is. But you could also use a new class. We also have the opportunity to use the Orchestrator automation engine to be able to take action with this. And then also we're using SCCM as the plumbing that we use to deploy that application to our end users. Sometimes I like to describe the relationship between Service Manager and SCCM like plumbing in a house. If I have a house and I'm living in my house, and I go up to my faucet and I turn on the water that's coming out of the faucet, I have a really easy to use self-service way of getting water from my faucet, right? Anybody can walk up to that faucet and get water out of it. That's what I want my end user experience to be like. I want anybody to be able to use this tool. That's what Service Manager paired with Orchestrator adds to this SCCM scenario in these particular cases, that any IT person can easily deploy these applications to my end users, or any end user can easily request these applications to their PC without having to have any complexity around getting that something delivered to them. So using that kind of faucet example, if Service Manager is the faucet that the water's coming out of that anybody knows how to use, there might be a lot of complicated routing happening regarding that water in my house to get there. That's what SCCM and Orchestrator are doing. They're doing all this complicated work for me, but I'm delivering a very simple user experience to my end users. That's ultimately the goal that I'm trying to accomplish. All right, so let's go into a little bit of a demo. Okay, so inside of my Service Manager self-service experience, what I have is I've published a variety of different service offerings. Now, these are both for IT users and end users. I'm going to use the end user example first because I think that presents the most kind of clear example of someone actually going and getting this request. So I have a request called install an application. In install an application, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give the user the ability to deploy that application. Now, there's a couple different ways I could ask them to deploy this app. So I'm starting off by asking a question of, where do I want to use this particular application? This is just a simple list that exists inside the request offering. It could be a class as well if I had a lot of different ways I want to distribute it, but I'm trying to keep it simple for my users. So I'm saying, where do you want to use this app? Well, I'm going to say all compatible primary devices, desktop, mobile, VDI. Now, why am I doing that? I'm doing that because SCCM 2012 provides me with the opportunity to be able to do user-centric targeting. I'm not limited to just saying, okay, deploy this particular device. I have the ability to be able to have a user or even an IT person say, just target any primary device that this particular individual uses. Now, what do I mean by primary device? SCCM has the capability to determine which devices you use on a reoccurring basis and are the ones that you're allocated to. This can either be administratively defined or it can be defined based upon a usage statistic to determine if this is your primary device or not your primary device. Now, the reason for that is because if a person's roaming from system to system, I may not want all of their applications deployed on those systems. Or in some cases, I might. So it just depends upon what your context of deploying applications is. I may also say that I want to allow for just specific devices. So for example, when I log into the portal, I already know my username. I already know the relationship between my user and my workstations. So for example, here are 3 workstations that are allocated to me as a primary user. I can see that their asset status is deployed. I can also see that 2 of them are Windows 8, 1 of them is Windows 7, and they have varying amounts of RAM. So for example, this is the one that I'm using right now. So in my particular case, I'm going to do a user-centric deployment because I think that's a kind of a nice way to start. I'm also going to select an application to install. Now these are a couple aspects of what I'm able to do by using Service Manager that I'm not necessarily going to be able to do when I'm using something like the SCCM agent that's running on a particular person's workstation. Although that's something that I think is a great way to install as well, this gives me a couple extra capabilities. One is I'm going to display whether or not approval is required for a particular application. So that approval is something that I'm going to have SCCM send to an individual to say, I want them to approve this particular application before it gets deployed. And then they would have to either reply to an email with an approval, or they'd have to say, yes, go. They have to click on the actual approval button inside of the Service Manager web console. A lot of times people like to have an email-based approval. I'm also capturing information about its cost. The reason why we're doing that is because a lot of the clients I'm working with, they're using Service Manager not just for request and incident management, but they're also capturing a lot of asset data there too. So they're using it both for software asset management and for device asset management. So we're going to present right away what the cost of that particular application is, so they know that when that bill comes back to their cost center, that's what that cost was from. It also provides us a really great way to track, in an audit sense, who's requesting particular applications installed on their workstations, so I can understand those requests when it actually comes to me. A particular example that I ran into is I had a client I walked into where they had about 300 or 400 Adobe Pro licenses deployed, and they had an unexpected cost as a result of that. And every time they asked why those were out there, they said, oh, the business needs them. Well, the problem was that they had no way to really reconcile who was asking for those and for what reason, and if they could potentially be removed at some point. So by implementing a style of request like this, this allows us to be able to allocate that request for that cost-centric piece of software directly to that person, so we can then charge them back for that particular cost, which can be really useful. I'm actually going to deploy Adobe Reader 11 in this particular case. And then I'm going to ask what it's actually needed for. Like, why do you need this particular piece of software? Okay. So that submits my request into Service.
Nate, did we lose you? Hold on, folks. I think Nate just lost the call.
Hey, Carrie, could you make me a presenter again?
Yes.
Sorry.
Hey, we lost you.
I don't know what's going on with this, but. Huh.
And then just reshare your.
Yeah. There we go. Awesome. Huh. Cool. All right, so we're going to go into Orchestrator. So right here you can see my Orchestrator runbook. My Orchestrator runbook contains a variety of different steps. So when that particular request comes in, this is a technique that I kind of want to show people that I think is going to be useful. What I'm passing in is the activity ID. What is the activity ID? The activity ID is the activity ID of the runbook automation activity that is contained within the template. So what does that mean? It means that my service request contains the runbook automation activity that says to execute this particular application deployment. That allows for me to be able to reference that service request. So I'm using the runbook automation activity to get the service request. Now, sometimes when you see this walk through, you see some people passing a lot of variables right at their initialized data. That can be okay because it's simple and people understand it. But the problem is that if you ever add additional variables that you want to pass to your runbook, that causes that particular synchronized runbook to become in a state that's no longer good with Service Manager. So I then have to relink it to my template, which is really challenging, and it's something that provides me with a lot of consternation when I'm having something that's in production and someone modifies it without asking me. So what I'd rather do is give myself the ability to be able to expand the things that I'm getting from Service Manager in a standardized way. So what I do is I always just pass the activity ID. So I pass the activity ID, and I get the runbook automation activity, which equals the activity ID. I then get the relationship between that runbook automation activity and the service request. So what that's really doing is it's saying, okay, this runbook automation activity is unique within the database. It's tied to the specific service request that I just kicked off, and it's related to this service request. So let's get the service request that's related to it. This is a reusable block of components for interacting with Service Manager. I use this in almost every automation, this relationship mapping here. So this service request contains information. So you can see, here's the actual execution that I sent through. So when I get the service request, you'll be able to see that it has a display name, that there's my display name, Self-Service End User Application Installation, SR28118. So that contains the information that I passed in. Now what I'm doing is I'm getting the computer relationship. So I'm getting the relationship between Service Manager, service request, and the Windows computer. Why am I doing that? Well, let me show you a little example here. I'm going to go into my service request. Okay, so here's a service request. It's got my person on it. It's got the title, Self-Service End User Application Installation, needed for job role. I want to deploy to all my compatible primary devices, and it's got Adobe Reader X. This contains then, you'll see, it's not just text. It's actually a relationship to another item in the database, Adobe Reader X. It's a software item relationship. So this software item relationship is actually detected by SCCM. And that's synchronized when it finds that particular application on my workstation. So that related object is actually the software items object of Adobe Reader X. Now, there's a couple ways I could have chosen to do this. In this particular case, I chose to extend the out-of-box software item class for Adobe Reader X to allow them to select it. And then I included things like the SCCM collection, whether or not it requires approval, what its software architecture is, who it's displayed to, and so on. I also could have, instead of doing this, I could have used my own custom class. My own custom class could have contained that information and not had a relationship to the out-of-box software items class. The reason why I chose to do this is because my computer shows the relationship between my computer and the software item class that's installed on it. And when I install software, it's tied to a particular version of that software. So not only can I select that particular piece of software from the self-service portal for installation, but it also then shows when that relationship is made to that computer, I see when it was installed and that it was installed, so I can validate it. So I have both ends of the spectrum. I also built into this an uninstall collection. So someone can look at the software installed on their Windows computer and then choose to uninstall it. So that computer that I'm installing software to, here's all the software items that are related to that particular piece of software, right? When that particular version of Adobe gets installed, that same exact one is going to show up as the related installed software. So it's consistent end to end. super cool solution, and it's consistent when people are looking at the data. Now, then again, if you didn't want to synchronize your software items from SCCM, you could use your own class. But I think one of the really neat aspects of this is it's also then tied to software inventory. So when I'm looking at software inventory in my system, that same relationship exists, the relationship between the software and the computer, what I chose to install, what was installed, and what I can uninstall. So all those relationships are consistent. So let's go into back over to Orchestrator. So what I'm doing is I'm getting that computer relationship. That computer relationship either exists or doesn't exist. So in that particular case, I didn't select a particular computer that I wanted to install it on. I said, put it on anything that I use. So when I look at this, I see number of objects from get computer relationship is greater than 0. Basically, it means that if this relationship contains 0 computers, then don't go this way. If it contains a computer, then the process is going to be slightly different. Not all that much different, but slightly different. If it has a relationship, number of objects from get computer relationship equals 0, that means that I basically chose to not select any computers that I want to install specifically on, and I want to use user-centric targeting. So what I'm then going to do is I'm going to get the relationship, but in this particular case, I chose not to deploy to a specific computer. So I would go down this path and I'd get the relationship between the service request and the Active Directory user. I'm then going to get the user that related user. Now, this is a really important thing to get here, is when you're getting a relationship, you use the related object GUID. A lot of people make the mistake of using the SC object GUID. That's actually the SC object GUID of the relationship itself. I don't want that. I want the related object GUID. So when you're doing those relationships, just something to be very watchful of, because a lot of people, including myself, will mess that up. So when I go down this path, I'm getting the user relationship, and I'm then getting the software associated with that particular request. So I'm launching a subrun book. Now, why am I doing that, and why do I have it structured this way? Well, a best practice in Orchestrator is really to try to not have your entire run book this gigantic spaghetti code in one single run book. There's a couple reasons for that. First, it's extremely hard to follow because instead of having a nice clean straight line, you start making these little snakes around the palette surface. And it also refreshes really slow. So there's a negative sort of user interface aspect of having too many icons on one page. So what I'm choosing to do is I'm getting the software. Now, notice here I'm waiting for completion. Why am I waiting for completion? Because if I let that go, if I uncheck wait for completion, what's going to happen is it's going to go to add user collection before this gets done. And then I won't have anything to pass. So in a lot of cases, I'd have to wait for completion until a particular process executes. So when I launch Get Software, I'm being passed a variety of information. I'm either being passed the computer name, if it exists, the type, the SC object GUID of the service request, and the OS bit type. Now, in this particular case, I'm saying if the type equals device, which in this case is not device, it's user. I'm using user. I'm going to go down this particular path. Note that that was passed here. So this is being passed basically at the get software level when I select here. You can see type is user versus type is device. Could I have done that in one path? Probably. Yeah, there's always ways to make this a little bit more efficient. In this particular case, I chose to make it a separated path. So I'm getting the user software relationship, which is the relationship between the service request and the software items. You saw that when I was showing the service request in Service Manager. It showed the service request and its relationship to the software item. I then get software items. Now notice I'm using the extension of software items because I've added extra fields. I'm then returning the SCCM collection 64-bit install back to this previous step. Now, did I have to actually have a specific collection for 64-bit install? No, because my user-centric targeting is able to determine what kind of device I'm running on. So I can actually have it choose for me in SCCM, which is really helpful. So that software relationship is returned. So you'll notice that when I look at my runbook, see where it says get software? That's returning the actual software relationships back and then launching add user to collection. So add user to collection then passes that collection ID and the username to add to collection. Then add to collection has a couple of neat things to it. First, I start off based upon a particular path. So I say, if computer name does not equal blank, so basically means if there's a computer name being passed here, go this route. If there's not a computer name being passed here, go this route. So in this particular case, what I'm doing is I'm selecting from the SCCM database the unique username of the user. I could also be passing the domain \username, but in this particular case, I chose to run it by using by actually retrieving the unique ID of that user from the database, because I've run into some problems where that unique user ID doesn't necessarily match up to what I was expecting it to be. So I'm querying the database. And I'd be happy to share this. I'll put it on a blog later, or this will also be available online. It's a very simple query, but I'm basically looking for unique username 0 inside of the database table. You could do that through WMI as well, using the SMSR user WMI query. And then I'm adding a collection rule. Now, this is a little different. For anybody who used the SCCM 2007 collection rules, it's a little different. It took me a couple of minutes here to figure out how to do this, and I want to kind of share some of the unique aspects of this. The collection I'm passing is the collection ID. That's the collection ID of the collection in SCCM. Now, that could also be the collection name. In this particular case, I want to use the ID just because that's how I chose to do it, not necessarily saying that you can't use the name. In this particular case, I use the ID. So you see the collection value type is tied to ID or name. That then has a direct rule or a query rule. So what I'm doing is I'm doing direct rules. The reason why I'm doing that is because I found that in the implementations I've done, it's been a lot faster. We haven't had to rely upon Active Directory groups or rely upon it redetermining what's in the collection. So in this particular case, I'm doing a direct rule. So I'm basically getting that unique value of the user, and I'm directly adding it to the collection. And I'm using the resource name. Now, if I was doing a query, if I was basically adding a bunch of queries, I could use query string and I could do it that way. But in this particular case, I found that this is more efficient. Then I'm getting the relationship between the add collection rules, determining if that, getting the relationship between the Active Directory user and their Windows computer. So this is really neat. There's actually a relationship that exists between the user and the Windows computer that then allows for me to be able to perform the client action of machine policy retrieval and evaluation. So basically, I'm going out and I'm saying, okay, guys, I just added you to the collection. Now I want to refresh your policies so you go and get that latest software very quickly. That's really helpful. Now, there's some characteristics there that we'd have to watch out for, like if you're using a RDS session, that might not come down right away. We have to figure out other ways to launch that. The neat thing about this kind of style, which is basically allowing a person to request it and then allowing this process to sort of take care of itself, is that if there was a gotcha that I ran into in this scenario, I can always add extra aspects later. And I can always add extra trees and other ways of running it. But from the user's point of view, they don't have to worry about all this stuff. Like, they don't have to worry about if they're on a VDI system or if they're on a workstation or a laptop or whatever. They don't have to worry about it. I just handle that all on the back end. It also normalizes how this process actually executes. So in SCCM, when I look at this, you'll see that I have a collection, a user collection called Application Management Adobe Reader. And then in there now is my username, Concurrency and Lesnosky. And Concurrency and Lesnosky is associated with some primary devices. I've got some laptops, and I've got my Windows Phone and my Windows Mail and my iPhone. So these different devices are tied to my user. And it's tied to the actual application deployment that's in the software library. So where did I get the collection ID that I used for the particular property? It's right here. Collection ID is CM2002D. That's the one that I used. Now, what I found is that this provides an easy user experience for end users, and it's a way that I can either provide it through the self-service experience of Service Manager's portal, or I could even put it on a SharePoint portal. So there's a lot of ways to be able to provision that up to my end users. Okay, now let's look at this from a slightly different perspective. Another perspective that I can look at this from is that of IT. So my general idea behind this is that I should be able to hire a guy off the street, and in 15 minutes they should be able to do an enterprise application deployment. If I was teaching them SCCM, there's a lot of power there that it would take me a while to convey to them. So if I was teaching them SCCM directly, then I'm giving them a lot of capability, but it's like if I gave my 6-year-old the keys to my car, right? She might be able to crash it down the street and run into a tree, but she wouldn't be able to actually do anything with it. But if I put her in a car seat and I drive her around and I do something really simple, I give them an easy experience. Maybe a 6-year-old driving a car is not the best example, but the general idea is that I want to allow this to be very, very simple for my IT people when I hire them. And then once they understand what they're doing, I can give them SCCM, and I can let them then execute on really complex processes to be able to arm other IT people. So this particular process has been executed many hundreds of thousands of times, and it's allowed for a lot of clients to have a very easy user experience. So I'll give you an example of how this works. So same kind of stuff, right? So an IT person comes into a self-service request. They're out in the field. They're one of 300 IT people out in the field. And I want to give them a service, a software as a service to deploy apps. So they're sitting at someone's desk, and that person says, you know, I'd really like Adobe Reader installed on my workstation. And he could say, yeah, you can do that yourself. You can go out to this self-service experience, and you can click on this and click on this and click on this, and you'll get it. And you can either go through this Service Manager portal, or you got this UI that pops up on your desktop through SCCM that we can deploy it to. And that might be a good way to convey it to them, right? But sometimes people just want you to do it for them. And I shouldn't have to remote into SCCM to go do that, right? So what I can do is I can give them this kind of experience. So I can say, okay, Mr. Jones, what kind of software would you like installed? Oh, I want Adobe Reader. Okay, great. So you can select that particular version, or even if it's like project, you can say, oh, this particular software is $300 to your cost center. Is that a problem? No big deal. Go ahead and charge them. Because it's a user you're selecting, it's still tied to them. That cost center is still tied. So you say, okay, let's find a user. John Lesnowski. Go look it up. Here's the PCs that a person could be using, right? So I could target a specific PC, or I could use another style, or I could just look up their username. Now, what is this thing? This is something I've explained a little bit in the performance and scale discussion at MMS so in detail, and I'll kind of go through it again one more time here just to make sure everybody has this technique available to them, which is I'm basically using a 3-step process. The reason I'm doing this is because if you have more than, say, 3,000 users, you're going to end up you're going to end up finding that these queries for computers don't return all your accounts. Don't return all your computer accounts, they don't return all your user accounts. So you have two options. You can either make the query larger, which is a problem, because then every time a user goes there, it's returning all 3,000, and then it's filtering in this box. That's not very functional from the standpoint of allowing it to provide a fast user experience. What I found is that, especially as you get up into tens of thousands range, it'll sit here and cycle it, please wait, for a long time. So what I do instead is I give them the ability to do pre-search filters and then filter this content based upon the pre-search filters. So I'll say, what's the domain of the user? I'll say concurrency.com. Notice the default is please select a domain. The reason why that's please select a domain is because it automatically fails this initial request because nobody's domain is please select a domain. So when you're building your query criteria, I set it up to provide 0 results initially, and then I let them put in a search criteria to be able to return information for. Now, centric to this, I can then deploy that application to my end user as an IT person. That actually uses the exact same process, right? It's just a different kind of experience for providing that user view for people to be able to deploy the applications. For me, that kind of ease of use, that kind of like ease of deploying the application to my end users provides IT with that simple experience and the end users with a simple experience. All right, so that's one example. What we're going to talk about now is taking this application deployment technique and using it in a workstation deployment scenario. So in a workstation deployment scenario, I've seen this become even more valuable. The reason why is because a lot of clients are using it not just for app deployment, but also for managing assets. So got to think about assets in a kind of disconnected way. When you order an asset, that asset may show up at your facility, and it might not be imaged with a Windows OS for several weeks. It's probably going to be sitting in a storage closet somewhere. Or I might want to send an asset to a facility and then have them use that asset and have it be imaged and plug it in when it gets there. Or I might even want to order PCs from a vendor, have that asset information be sent into an asset database, and then log that MAC address to deploy applications to when they plug it in at the site. So there's a lot of opportunities for me to be able to tie both asset management and app deployment and workstation provisioning together. Now, a lot of companies, they use SCCM and they come in and they just pixie boot their workstation and deploy a PC, and that's fine. But the problem is that that process isn't tied to the asset tracking process, so then they have to come out and do asset tracking separately. So if you tie that process to the asset process and to the application deployment process, you provide all the mechanisms to capture the right information, and you do it quickly and efficiently. What I've found is that using this process saves my clients between 30 minutes to an hour per workstation deployment when we add up all the different things that they're doing on workstation deployment. I think you'll find that's pretty interesting. Also, we've used it hundreds of thousands of times to get these numbers. So I think that's something that I think when you look at that time savings, I think you'll find that it's very valuable. We did this by combining the application deployment process that I just showed with an OS deployment process and an asset tracking based upon serial number, tying the custodian to the workstation, as well as the relationship with the MAC address. All right. Let's get out of there. We'll go into Service Manager. All right, now first I want to show you what a custodian is. So I'm on my particular workstation, and on my particular workstation, down at the bottom you have something called CI information. Now CI information has a custodian record. That's the most basic version of a custodian, which is basically this is coming from the deployed computer record in SCCM, not the OS record. Okay, so that deployed computer record allows for me to be able to tie a custodian that's non-relative. Basically, it's not tied to who the primary user is. Why is that important? Because a lot of companies need to track their assets tied to who asked for it to be purchased, so it goes back to the appropriate cost center. That could be both for a workstation, a server, it could be for a mobile phone, it could be almost anything, right? So that relationship between the who ordered it and whose cost center is it tied to, so I can manage my assets and manage chargeback, is important. So I can either do that based upon the dynamic detection of primary user, I could do it based upon a custodian, or combine the two together and say, if the primary user is different than custodian, maybe we want to look at that system. Finally, it allows for us to be able to take that information and reconcile it back when we're doing software relationships as well, because I know the custodian, I know the software relationship to the workstation. Finally, if you're using another add-in pack for asset management, like you've developed your own, or using Provence, or using Syerson's, those have that custodian relationship. Basically what's happening with that is this Windows OS record, which is NLW8A, which is a Windows OS running on my hardware, that's related to an asset in the database. So I may even have multiple Windows operating systems tied to one asset. Like, for example, I dual boot, so my physical hardware has multiple assets. So that uniting of those processes allows me to be able to have a much more effective way of managing my resources. All right, so I'm going to have a couple different ways I'm going to execute on this. The first way I'm going to execute on it is through enterprise workstation deployment. So I've got something called new enterprise workstation deployment. This is from the perspective of an IT person, because usually they're the person deploying a particular workstation. So I'll say, what's the MAC address of the workstation? 11, 11, 11, 11, 11, 11. What's the domain? So why am I asking for the MAC address? The reason I'm asking for the MAC address is because I'm going to pre-provision this workstation into SCCM for a particular version of the Windows OS at a particular SCCM site, so and tying it to the assets. So I'm tracking all those things together keying off of the MAC address. I could just as easily use serial number or use a unique ID that I got from my manufacturer or my asset ID internally. There's a lot of ways to be able to key off it. I just found that MAC address for some of the companies I'm working with is something they already know, so it's just something we'd be leveraging. So then I say, who's the primary user who's going to use this? It's going to be me. All right, so you can see that both my admin account and my non-admin account show up. I'll just pick my admin account. Then I'm going to select a language. All right, my language in this particular case, it's not Romulan or Vorlon, it's English. All right, so let's select English. And then I'm going to deploy some software. Now, that's interesting because in the past it might have been really useful just to deploy software directly to a physical piece of hardware, right? Because maybe I'm doing MDT and I want to pre-stage those applications in the MDT records, or maybe I'm just using SCCM straight up without MDT and I want to add this computer to certain hardware collections. Easy to do right here, right? I can say, okay, this guy, not only am I provisioning the system, but he needs these particular pieces of software. In my case, I'm actually doing user-centric deployment. So I'm saying this user has these relationships to this software. So relate this to the person I'm tying to the computer. So I can do it right, even though I'm not necessarily having to have two requests here. It provides me with a really consistent and concise user experience. In this process, I've solved both asset management and workstation deployment. So that gets deployed. I'll show you how this works behind the scenes. Go into Orchestrator. We've got something called OS deployment process. Now, this looks busy. There's a lot of cool things that happen here. All right, that same reusable block of capabilities right here. So I get the runbook automation activity, I get the relationship, I get the service request. So that service request contains a bunch of information. I get extensions from the service request. Then I get the relationship between the service request and the Active Directory user, which is the user who's related as about configuration item. You'll notice that when I get relationships between computers and users, there's actually going to be many users related to that service request. So let me just show you an example of that. When I look at a request in Service Manager, I'll just look at this one real quick. All right. If I look at the history, when this gets provisioned, you'll notice that there's a couple relationships that are made. Affected user, created by user. There's this relationship class that's there. So when I return users from my relationship from my service request, it has a class that I use to filter on to get the right one. So in my particular example, the relationship of the assigned user is the about configuration item relationship. That relationship then brings back the assigned user data and actually goes on two separate paths. It goes and gets that asset ID. It gets the relationship of the update. It updates the asset to deployed, and it relates the asset to the user account. So it sets the related user to using the asset has custodian user relationship from asset computer to Active Directory user. This is actually a custom class that I have for asset computer. You could just as easily use deployed computer, or excuse me, computer parentheses deployed. Now in here, we're taking that get assigned user data as successful, and I'm forwarding forward. Now, this is really interesting. What we decided to do is we decided to uniquely number every workstation. Now, you could do that on serial number, or you could just do it on a unique counter. What we decided to do is to use a counter. Now, you could also use, instead of using a counter, which is sometimes considered a bad practice, we could instead use a database, which is tracking it, or a class field, inside a new class that we add in Service Manager. In this case, we just used a counter, which there's probably a lot of better ways to do this. But what's interesting about this is, and key to know, is we have the job concurrency on this particular runbook set to 1. So that way we don't have multiple processes trying to get the counter at the same time. This allows for us to ensure that this process always runs one at a time. So it uniquely increments the counter for the computer name. It gets the counter value, which we just incremented, and returns it. Note that this process can run more than one at a time. Well, in this case, it's set to 1, but we could set it to run more than one at a time. Now, the reason for that is because it takes a while for some of these things to execute from start to finish, and I can do a lot more work than one at a time. So if I set them to execute concurrently, that then allows for me to be able to have a user experience that's very fast for the person requesting the provisioning, but also allows for me to protect myself from things that can't be done concurrently, which is like a counter operation or looking for the unique value in a database. So I've chosen to encompass this counter in a subroutine. I then prep the data, which is basically computer name is C plus the counter name, which is starts at 4 million, I think. We then add the computer to Active Directory. Now, why do we do this? You don't have to do this, you can actually have SCCM do this as part of the provisioning process. The reason why we did this is because we didn't want to wait for Service Manager to synchronize that account from the Active Directory to Service Manager. We didn't want to have to wait and kick off the connector to get that record in there. We wanted them to be able to see it and even deploy additional applications to it right away. So we chose to create that Active Directory computer object in the database in a way which the synchronized computer object from the Active Directory connector would bring in and merge with. So that's how we set this up. So what we do is we get that Active Directory info of the user. We check to see if the OU of the user, we basically determine the user OU based upon the Active Directory user's OU. We then map the published data. What does this mean? Basically means we may be using this in QA or might be using it in prod. In this particular case, it's my QA one. So I'm mapping this to QA and then adding the computer to Active Directory. And then I'm creating the computer object in the Service Manager with the same component. So that computer object is getting created in Active Directory in SCSM. I'm creating the deployed computer, which will then also be synchronized from SCCM. And I'm making the relationship between the user and associating them as the custodian and the primary user to that create computer object. So I'm making all those relationships before it even gets deployed, which is really helpful because it provides an instant experience to the users. The thing you got to watch out for is making sure that you do it in a way which merges properly with the Active Directory connector. And that's something that you just got to be you definitely want to do it in a lab first to make sure that your relationships are made right. All right, so we create that Active Directory user, the Active Directory computer, and then we add the computer to SCCM. So what I'm doing is I first start by removing the unprovisioned computer from SCCM, and then I add the computer to SCCM. And then I add the collection rule. So I take that computer and I add it to the collection rule of Windows 8 base. So I have an imaging collection called Windows 8 base that computer is found in. The computer name has now been added to SCCM programmatically. So then I'm saying take that computer name and add it as a direct rule to that particular imaging process. So then when the person boots that particular workstation, it gets the right OS that I chose. I might even let them choose the OS. In this particular case, I'm not. I might even let them choose the OS. And after it gets deployed, it's tied to the right asset in the database. It's got the right custodian, and it's related to the primary user that I had set initially, even though then that user can get overwritten through usage. So I'm pre-staging it and giving me the appropriate process for it. So what that's doing is then it completes adding the computer to SCCM, and then I add the applications using that same application deployment process. In this particular case, I'm not waiting for completion because I don't necessarily need my runbook to wait for that. I could have it wait if I wanted to give a failure status associated with this. Now, that kicks off the process of the original package deployment process. So then those applications are added to the user's relationship. And then because they're the primary user on that device, they log in, they get their apps. So it provides a really nice, consistent user experience that uses the power of SCCM 2012 and provides me with a way of managing the relationship between the users and the assets. Now, how does this look in a slightly different circumstance? This is where internally at concurrency for us, it's been super useful. So we have an area called My Computer. And it uses the exact same automation, just asks questions in a slightly different way. So I'm going to go to my request form, and in here I say, what workstation OS build do you want to play? This is my workstation. I'm the end user. I'm not an IT person at this point. I'm an end user. I'm going out to my portal. I'm saying, oh, my workstation's totally screwed up, and I want to refresh it. This is a production scenario we have right now inside our company. I can say, what OS build do you want to play? Windows 7 Service Pack 1 or Windows 8? Of course I want Windows 8. And I say, I want to refresh this particular workstation. So what this will basically do, it'll say, all right, take that guy's workstation and put it in the upgrade collection to re-image his system and put back down any software products. So I could say, what applications do you want installed? I can do the exact same thing where I say all compatible primary devices or only this workstation, right? So in this particular case, I use the same capability, just in a slightly different way, to give a user the ability to re-image their own system and get the right content. Now, that sounds slightly scary to some people, right? Like, oh my gosh, my user's re-imaging their own systems? Cats and dogs living together? Oh man. So in this particular circumstance, what we're doing is we're doing some abstraction of the user data. We're also sending them an email ahead of time saying that their computer is going to have the user data removed, and we're using USMT to be able to remove some of that data. In some circumstances, we'll use USMT to be able to copy their data off their system. But for us, we don't keep anything on our systems anyway, so we allow people just to refresh their workstations anytime they want. So that kind of process allows for an end user to be able to do their upgrade themselves. Now, if it was Windows 7 to Windows 8, maybe my old system, maybe the system I'm upgrading is Windows 7 and I'm going to Windows 8, that's a scenario where I can expand beyond the scenario I talked about now. So I can say, what if I have these particular software items installed on my workstation? I've got Windows 8 and I've got these particular software items installed on it. What happens if they're running Office 2010? Do I lay Office 2010 back down? Of course not. I can say, if this particular application is installed, map it to another application type that allows for me to upgrade to the appropriate app. So that relationship data all exists in the CMDB to facilitate that upgrade process. So that gives me a really nice user experience. Okay, getting low on time, so I'm going to go through my last user experience, and this is sort of the one I kept around because I think it's a very useful experience, which is server application deployment. What do I mean by this? Well, we just talked about a lot of client-centric stuff, and client-centric stuff is really useful because it serves all of our end users, and for every one of those many hundreds or thousands of requests, it has a really direct payback. In the server space, we may or may not have lots of servers, but we want it to be done the same every time, because when we do things the same every time in a way that we know it's going to be successful, in a way we can maintain, it gives us an experience which is standardized for me to support, and it provides me with higher uptime. So what I've done is I've set up a server application deployment process, and this saves on average between 30 minutes to an hour per application deployment that I've seen. So there are a couple ways that we can use this. I'll give you two examples. The first example I'm going to use is going to be deploying a particular application. So I'll say, I would like to deploy an enterprise server application to my enterprise. That enterprise server application process gives me a list of my servers. Maybe I want to deploy to Cincy WSS, and then I want to deploy the concurrency business platform to that particular system. Now, in this particular case, I'm using the same software item, but I'm deploying it, I'm filtering to say only the ones that are tagged for servers can be deployed to my particular enterprise application. I can also choose how I want it deployed. That deployment process can use a very similar way of using SCCM to actually deploy the app, but deployed in a normalized way that I've defined for my business. That can also leverage Virtual Machine Manager if I'm managing templates. Now, another process which I think is even more kind of consistent with the overall vision of enterprise IT is the idea of doing things like patching operations. That's something that also leverages things like SCCM. So I'm going to show you a really interesting relationship here that I think is going to be helpful. So I'll come into Patch Data Center Services, and the first thing that I'm asked for isn't the server name, it's the application. So in Service Manager, I have this thing called business services, and business services are basically these abstract things I deliver to my customers. My intranet, network connectivity, a CRM application, Active Directory, and so on. And those are made up of servers which support it. So the internet contains servers and is potentially a high availability model. It contains maybe 2 web servers, a SQL server, an application server, and so on. And what I can do is I can build these management processes into my platform to execute on automations. So it can either be the deployment of application content, or it could be the deployment of patches. So in this particular application, I'm going to select a patch window that I want those patches to occur in. And when I use that patch window, what's going to happen is, at that time frame, Orchestrator will go through the servers in that business service and apply the patches, but reboot them in specific time frames, in order, putting it in a maintenance mode so I don't get alerts from my operations management system, And it does it without me having to physically log into the servers, reboot them, and make sure the application is working, because I can build the tests right into the orchestrator process. So what I've seen is that a lot of my customers who are data center heavy, this is a godsend because they were spending hundreds of hours every quarter just doing patching, because a lot of people don't just release their patches into the wild. What they want to do is they want to validate their application works, and the only way a lot of these companies have thought to do it is to, okay, I'm going to log into the server, I'm going to click on deploy patch, I'm going to reboot, make sure it's working properly. We want to get away from that. So what I can do is I can either deploy patches to business services en masse and have it cycle through all these business services, or have a cycle that allows us to do all business services in a controlled way. Or I can allow an individual to do maintenance activities like a patching process or even a reboot without having to rely upon intelligent end-user management. Instead, I can be an IT person, kick this off, go to dinner, come back, and it'll be done, and I won't have had a downtime. So I submit that, and that allows Orchestrator to be able to take advantage of that process. So an Orchestrator, I can build in these server management processes into this interface to allow for me to be able to automate. And the way that I do that is by using things like Operations Manager and its start and stop maintenance mode activities that allow for me to be able to patch and update without having to manage a lot of extra tasks. So it allows for me to do some pretty amazing things. I can build that right into my release management process, or I can build it into my patch management process that a person manages as an individual software as a service initiation process. All right, so we're getting pretty close to 11 o'clock. So what I would suggest as a next step is that you take these processes that I'm talking about, software application deployment, workstation application deployment, server application deployment, patching, data center operations, and you consider how using Service Manager as an easy self-service experience for your users to be able to initiate complex operations can help you. These specific examples might not directly map up to what you want to accomplish, but I think you'll find that they're giving you some useful techniques that allow for you to be able to build ones that do match your process. The suggestion I would have is when you're looking at these processes, first start by identifying what the ROI is tied to that process. So you say, if I automate this, what's it going to save me? So if you've got 100 servers, you might not find as big of a value out of updating your automation process for servers as much as you might find serving your 3,000 end users, right? Or vice versa, if you have 1,000 servers, this patching process might provide you a huge value. So what I would suggest is take a look at where the ROIs are, and then look at using Service Manager as an easy self-service experience to allow for these complex operations that will provide normalized execution and a great user experience for your end users in a way that will save them a lot of time and make their experience of managing the data center or their end users a lot more fluid and allow you to respond to users faster. All right, so I would welcome taking any questions that you have at this time. Also, if you had to ask a question, you can also unmute, so that's fine too. Okay, great. Cool. So if you have any follow-up questions, I'm going to be blogging on these solutions, so you have a little bit of walkthrough on what that looks like, and maybe you can follow along. So I'm going to be putting some of those up on the Concurrency blog. Also do some tweeting from time to time, so I'll make sure I post those on Twitter as well. And I want to thank Microsoft. I thought this was a really fun experience, and it's a huge blessing to be able to talk to you guys today. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk.
Thanks, Nate, for your presentation. It was really good. And just to those on the phone, I will be posting the recording, and I'll get a copy of Nate's deck, and I'll post it up on the MVP SkyDrive location folder for that too. So thanks again, and we'll hopefully see everyone next Tuesday, the 21st, for our next session. Enjoy your day.